Richard Williams is a 50-year-old man who is interested in tennis. He lives with his family in Louisiana, a city where people aren't interested in tennis, and on the other hand, racist behaviors are also rampant in it. However, Richard doesn't spare anything to achieve his goals. He tries to learn something to teach his daughters from anyone and anywhere, even from the radio. In order to provide a free coach for his daughters, Richard prepares a brochure of introducing Venus and Serena. Then he takes brochures to famous coaches and tries to convince them that his daughters are future stars. He talks about his daughters and even expresses his motivation for these insistences. In fact, Richard watched the game of Virginia Rosic, a colored Romanian who won $40,000, realizes the wrong path in her life. Because a few days of Virginia's income is equal to Richard's annual income, so Richard does his best. Of course, Strickland, opposite neighbor, considers his efforts to be harsh towards his daughters and often insults him and turns the girls against their father. Richard tries to reveal his true motivation for heroism but fails. At the same time, Richard's wife asks him to stop fighting with Strickland. While Richard and the girls are getting ready to go to practice, Oracene leaves for work and says goodbye to Richard. Richard and the girls, after a journey, reach to the playground. Venus and Serena are practicing and Richard collects the leaves in the ground. Meanwhile, one of the locals calls him King Richard, and is surprised that he isn't resting. Also, Richard replied, rest is equal to achieving goals in dreams and sleep. After that, Richard teaches Serena and Venus what he learned and then practices with them. Meanwhile, Isha and Lynn also collect the balls. In another corner, Tund with a lot of concentration, she is studying when two boys disturb her from behind the fences. Richard leads Tund and the girls into the van and goes to the boys to ask them not to disturb Tund, but they make fun of Richard, and as Richard goes to the van, but they attack him. On the way back home, Richard talks about the bitter memories of his youth, that due to not having a sponsor, he has always been beaten by others and has never been respected, but from now on, the world will respect all his daughters. When arriving home, Strickland remonstrates with Richard and believes that the police should look into his upbringing. Richard goes home without an answer. Oracene welcomes her husband and children. Lynn exposes her father's beating. Oracene asks Richard for details, then she talks about their hard living conditions and their constant working. She also believes that children need better conditions for their development. Richard praises Vince's performance and preparation to his wife and promises to eventually find a professional coach for the girls. After dinner, while the girls are playing pantomime, he repeats motivational sentences with them and asks them to sleep after planning. He also gives them hope that they will soon have enough money to buy the necessary number of beds. After that, Richard goes to work, and even in the guard room, he doesn't give up on finding a coach. A few days later, Richard shows a video of Venus and Serena's introduction to a professional trainer named Vic, hoping to get his attention, but again fails because Vic believes that tennis is a highly technical sport and to be professional and it requires years of professional practice, so he has no hope for a bright future for Richard's daughters. Richard is sad in terms of Vic and he goes to a fast food restaurant with his family for dinner. Without letting the family know about his meeting with Vic, he leaves the fast food restaurant and heads to the tennis court. As he is calming himself down with his racket, the drunk Rock finds Tund and tells him about his evil intention to assault her. Richard attacks him, but Rock's friends also attack Richard, and after enough beating him, they let him go. Richard is looking for Rock to kill him with his gun. At this moment, he sees Rock, who is shot from inside a car as soon as he leaves the store. After that, Richard returns home wounded and again worries and disturbs his wife with his wounds. The next day, Richard takes Venus and Serena to a real gym to practice. According to his mother's words, he explains that women who have a specific path, they are the strongest and most dangerous people. Therefore, he asks them to meet the club. In a few minutes show, they knew they are dangerous. They entered to the gym and saw Paul Cohen training with McEnroe and Pete. Richard goes ahead and asks Cohen to watch the girls so that he might accept to coach them. Cohen refuses to accept the teenager and even watch them. At this moment, Mac leaves the field and Richard, by getting Pete's approval, satisfies Cohen, evaluates Serena and Vince with several balls. Cohen finally accepts. After a few minutes of playing, he realizes the talent of both sisters. After the game, he motivates them. Vince is motivated by winning Wimbledon and Serena express being the best player. After returning home, all were happy by hearing the news that Vince passed the test. But Richard lets his wife know about Vince being accepted for free tuition and they both feel bad for Serena. The next day, while Serena is upset with Cohen's decision, Vince and her father motivate her and satisfy her by promising to record Vince's training. Vince shows up at practice and Richard keeps interfering with Cohen's training. Paul asks Vince to ignore her father's comments. Meanwhile, Oracene also trains Serena and doesn't stop trying for Serena's progress. Cohen also played a video, Capriati and her coach, Rick, introduces Macy to Vince. Then he talks about Capriati's $2 million income by participating in junior tournaments and being recognized by sponsors, and encourages Richard and Vince to participate in these tournaments as well. Finally, Vince participates in the tournament, but she is the only black participant. Vince enters the field and after defeating each opponent, she goes to another field. She wins all her competitions and faces the wrath of her rivals. In the end, she wins the last round and wins the Junior Championship Cup. On the way back home, the girls cheer for Vince's championship and Isha makes fun of Vince's rivals. Richard gets upset with Isha's teasing and asks them to stop discussing tennis. Lynn showing the championship cup and she flaunts her sister's superiority. Richard takes his girls out for drinks to finish off the competition discussion and bragging. Then he moves without waiting for them. Oracene is surprised and urges Richard to go back. Then she criticizes him for disturbing her daughter's happiness. Then, while they discuss, the girls arrive and are upset and surprised by their father's behavior. Richard holds a family meeting at home to watch the movie, and after the movie is over, he asks everyone's opinions and views about it. Each of them gives an opinion, Richard seeing that the main concept isn't clear to anyone, so he decides to replay the video, which is met with the objection of his wife. Finally, Richard states the main concept. By explaining Cinderella's modest behavior in front of her surroundings and keeping her heart clean from turbidity and evil, so he encourages children to be humble. Because without humility so they will not taste true victory. After the girls go to their room, Oracene with a little anger, she brings up the story of placing the children in front of the store again and with emphasis, and she asks her husband to never do this again. Richard with Vince and Serena in the heavy rain at night, but they resume training. After returning home, they notice the presence of the police at their house, who intervened after a call from a citizen to assess the quality of life of the girls. Richard gets angry and he asks them to look under the beds and inside the cabinets. The police officer asks about the children's academic status and practice in the heavy rain. Richard explains that the future doctor and lawyer and several tennis stars are growing up in his house. Then he goes on to say that people's views on his strictness with his children are completely correct and that he applies this strictness to keep them away from delinquency and addiction. The police officer is affected by Richard's words and leaves his house. After that, Oracene goes to Strickland's house and asks him, due to the hardship of having 5 girls, so she asks him not to interfere in their lives. After that, Vince will appear in another match. At the same time, Serena also took advantage of the situation and without informing the family, registers in the competition. In the middle of Vince's game, one of the referees praises Serena, and in this way, Richard looks for Serena. When he finds her, he asks her to continue this match until the end and take advantage of its moments. After that, while Vince won the gold and Serena silver in their age, they are excited of the attention of magazines. In the meantime, Richard is happy about the performance of girls, but the news of the arrest of a black man with police kicks and truncheon makes him upset. After that, the phone rings and they were invited to a match with the presence of the former president. In this match, Serena and Vince take pictures next to him, then they enter to the ground. While Richard enjoys watching his daughters play, Cohen approaches him along with George MacArthur and Laird Stabler. Cohen introduces George with the nickname Big Boss. Then George introduces Laird and considers him wonderful. As soon as they sit down, the Laird compliments Richard's girls and calls them amazing, so he asks Richard to make a contract with them and leave the girls' development to them. Laird and George, they keep using the super word for Serena and Vince, but Richard annoys. Richard asks why this word is used and realizes that George and Laird, considering the race of the Williams family, they weren't expected to be champions and to be good in white sports. George confirms this and expresses his intention to inspire Serena and Vince to other people in the community. Therefore, he insists on signing a contract. Laird also offers shoes, rackets, and trainers, Richard infuriating again. After that, Richard, by letting go of his stomach win, he expressed his disapproval and anger about this meeting and left there. Richard angrily goes to his daughters and they leave the club together. After that, Cohen goes to Richard's house and asks him to stop being stubborn, but Richard informs his decision not to sign a contract with Representative and even not to participate in junior competitions. Cohen is surprised by Richard's decision and tries to convince him not to ruin the children's future just because he is angry about being insulted by Representative, but Richard is determined in his decision and even asks for Cohen's apology. Cohen leaves Richard's house and wishes Vince win Wimbledon. After that, Oracene is upset that Richard didn't consult her for this important matter and criticizes him. After this incident, Richard called Rick Massey and invited him to Compton, California to see his kids play. Rick arrives at Richard's house and they immediately go to the local Compton field with Richard, Vince and Serena. One of the neighborhood boys complains about the presence of a white man on the local land, but after Richard's approval, he leaves him. Rick marvels at the performance of the two sisters and promises that the next Michael Jordan will emerge, and Richard asserts that the next 2 Michael Jordans will emerge from his family. Then Rick gives the Williams family the agreement he made with Jennifer Capriati, in which the cost of their education, coach and in fact the cost of living with Rick. Then he declares his earnings to be 15% of the children's future earnings. At this moment, Richard talks from Nick, another coach who wants to sign a contract with the Williams family. The performance of Nick at the same time as a good coach resembles a factory that uses to develop athletes from each coach. Rick also leaves it up to the family to choose the coach. Richard also said that he wants Rick because he makes him happy. After that, Richard also asked them to support the whole family except Tund, and he mentions all the expenses of education, housing, new van, and even a job for himself. Rick is shocked at first but accepts the situation with faith in Vince and Serena's performance. Finally, the Williams family moves to Florida, and after arriving, without wasting any time, they go to Rick's academy. Rick gives a warm welcome and Vince and Serena join Capriati in the game. Rick talks about participating in various competitions and Richard at the same time talks about his decision not to participate in junior competitions, and Rick disagrees, but, in the end, he agrees with Richard's explanation that children need to grow in all areas. 3 years have passed and still Vince and Serena aren't competing. One of the reporters interviewed Richard because he was called selfish for this decision, and he again talks about his decision for his daughters was perfect. After that, the reporter interviews Vince and she says with confidence that she will overcome sales. The reporter is surprised by her confidence when she hasn't participated in competitions for several years and asks the reason for this confidence. Richard, seeing the reporter's focus on this issue, so he disrupts the interview. After that, Vince finds out about the Intercontinental Tournament and asks Rick to satisfy Richard. Rick talks to Richard and convinces him to consider entering the tournament. Then, at the same time, Richard sees the image of Jennifer on TV, who has been arrested by the police for being with 2 youths carrying heroin. He quickly takes his daughters out of the club. Seeing Vince and Serena not showing up for practice, Rick goes to Richard's house. Richard brings up the issue of Capriati and talks about his concern about children being pressured by competitions and then turning to drugs. Rick criticizes Richard's actions and expresses helplessness and exhaustion. He tells Richard that he knows the kids focus on music and school and other activities, and of course training with other coaches makes him. Rick sadly leaves Richard and prays that this stubbornness will not harm his daughter's future. Vince leaves the house after hearing her father's words. Oracene asks Richard to go after Vince, but Richard refuses to do so, remembering his sacrifices. Oracene begins to speak, pointing out her own role in these successes and reminding him that this position wasn't achieved alone. Then she angrily says that the difficult living conditions and also the discovery of Richard's sons would force any woman to leave, but she remains, and the main reason for that is her children, not Richard. In the end, Oracene angrily asks Richard to give Vince a chance to make a decision after their efforts and sacrifices, because she might leave her father if she is too strict. Richard goes to Rick's academy to comfort Vince and finds Vince training. Vince angrily throws the balls and then criticizes her father. Richard calls Vince to his side and then tells the story of a bitter day. From the day he was beaten a lot by a white man just for touching his hand, and at the same time his father didn't defend him, so he leaves the place. He continues that he did all this to protect her children, and he wants Vince not only her presence but to represent all black girls. Vince accepts her father's consolation and asks him to allow her to participate in the match to prove to everyone that she has the whole abilities. After accepting participation in the mock, Rick calls Patrick for a contract. Patrick expresses his intention to attract Vince by offering $3 million. Then he gives the contract to Richard and Richard asks him for the contract to ask Vince's opinion. Vince starts reading the memorandum. Then Rick asks Patrick to leave the Williams family alone so they can make a better decision. Finally, Vince doesn't accept the contract and Richard believes that after years of trying, she can't accept the first offer. Vince enters the West Bank tournament in Oakland and after a few hands, she finally defeats Stafford. After that she will compete with Vicario. The best opener in the world is getting ready while the representatives offer for Vince exceed $3 million. Richard notices Serena's sadness and regret and asks her to remain stubborn as always and prepare herself to be the best player. Then Oracene by braiding Vince's hair and she prepares her for the big race and asks her to always remember her identity and be proud of it. The match begins with Vince facing the Spanish Vicario. Vince plays with all her strength and in the first round and overcomes Vicario. Then while Vicario gets very angry, she leaves the ground under the pretext of toilet. She returns to the ground for the weakening of Vince's spirit about 10 minutes and succeeds in reducing Vince's spirit. After Vince's successive service failures, Vicario wins. Richard and Oracene go for Vince to comfort her that although she didn't win but she succeeds to shake the body of the first person. Then they walk out of the arena together and meet Vince's fans waiting for her autograph. 9 months later, while Vince was 15 years old, she signed a contract worth $12 million and Serena joined Vince 2 years later. In this way, all of Richard's plans for his children become reality. Vince until the age of 41, she won Wimbledon 5 times. She was the first African-American woman to become the first person in the world. Serena also until the age of 40, she won 23 times Grand Slam champion and she is considered by many to be the greatest player in the history of sports.